Patrick, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so ultrafine particles, amazing little creatures, and hopefully I can make them sort of interesting for you and the sensing of them. So we'll get going. So the little review of the electrostatic PM sensor technology, spending most of the presentation talking about sensitivity factors and the first stage of how to use these sensors, a little section about self-diagnostics, and then conclusions. So a quick slide on history. We Emisense developed this kind of on our own for a few years. We licensed it to Continental, which some of you might recall. Around the time of the sort of Dieselgate issues, the business case for it changed and Continental ceased development. We've kept it alive over the last few years, actually advanced in some other areas. And then just recently announced that we closed a new global licensee. So we have a new tier one supplier that is advancing the technology. We can't yet, or it's up to them when they want to announce themselves. So we're not yet saying their name, but it's exciting to see it being adopted now. So quick review of the measurement principle. So this is essentially a 1 kilovolt electrostatic trap, right? So concentric. So as if you picture an inner electrode and then a concentric outer electrode, exhaust gas is drawn in through the electrode by a Venturi tip, using the exhaust gas velocity itself to create the vacuum. The field, the 1 kilovolt field, does essentially field directed assembly. So it attracts, the positively charged particles are attracted to one electrode and the negatively charged particles are attracted to the other electrode. By the way, the neutral particles they don't participate in the measurement. So that'll be one of the things we talk about today. And then you get to an equilibrium where you have these, sort of dendritic assemblies, and they have very high charge density at the tips. When the length gets sufficient, the counter electrode forces exceed the van der Waals forces holding it all together, and you have highly charged particles exiting the sensor and creating a current. And that current is proportional to particulate mass. It's also proportional to particulate number, because it's really a direct measurement of surface area, right, or charge carrying area. So the advantages of it: this is a very sensitive or high sensitive sensor, very fast response time, a continuous signal. So anyone who's used, for example, the resistive accumulators, you could see that that's in contrast as far as continuity of signal, and they're durable. Limitations, which we'll talk about: there is a startup time because you've got to form these field directed dendrites, right? The measurement principle itself needs those. It does require application specific or engine family specific calibration. The actual sensitivity is relative to the particle morphology, and transients, which again we'll talk about here, but pressure pulses in the exhaust disrupt the equilibrium. You have a little signal spike when they get disrupted, and then the signal recovers. So even though it's a useful real-time sensor, at a minimum, doing some filtering and averaging for those transients is necessary. So that's kind of the very high level summary. Going back a moment to actually just talk about first principles. We were first starting to work on this. We observed this amplification effect. So the signal coming out of the sensor is about 3 orders of magnitude greater than the natural charge of the particles, right? So I don't know if any of you recall when Honeywell, 15 years ago, had a similar sensor that was trying to just measure the natural charge of particles coming through, but that's in the low picoamps range. We are able to get it up into the super high amount of nanoamps, but three orders of magnitude higher. And the question is, what's the mechanism there, right? What's creating that amplification effect? So during some of the early research, we saw signal enhancement and similar sort of signal things in some of the older papers and older work that had been done with carbon nanotubes, nanofilaments essentially. And you can see that really, at the 300 micron scale going all the way down to the 1 micron scale, you've got these tips that have very high charge density at the tips of these structures. So we sort of said, oh, that might be a hypothesis. Let's explore that a little bit more. At the time, we were working with Matty Marique at Ford, who's since retired, but he and Dave Bilby and Dave Kabinski and a few others there did work with our first generation sensors and actually even with some analogs using flat plates so that we could get some imagery. And in fact, that is the case. Essentially, you see these little filaments that form on the surfaces. So they're, less than 1,000 times the distance between the electrodes, but little nanofilaments that under the field they're upright and they look very much like other previous sort of nanofilament research, and that did allow us to confirm that that's a big part of the amplification effect. I referenced a couple papers here that were in the Journal of Aerosol Science in 2016 and 2018 that really are kind of a good way to understand the first principles, the underlying concept of how it works. So this before we start talking about sensitivity, this is just an interesting qualitative look at the signal, the information that you get out of an electrostatic sensor. So this upper plot is it's an FTP cycle, and the red trace is the sensor signal. And although it looks like most of the transients are lined up, they're not always perfectly lined up, because like I said, the pressure pulses sort of move things around sometimes. But the point is, compared to a resistive accumulator, there's actually a lot of information there. And in this particular sample, which isn't entirely fair, I guess, but in this particular example, during the entire FTP cycle, the resistive accumulator doesn't get a single measurement done, right? So it's just about to get a measurement done when the cycle ends. So again, just kind of a qualitative look at the information. And I don't know how many of you, I think a significant portion might have worked with resistive accumulators, but you're sort of familiar with that response time challenge. So starting to talk about sensitivity. So I'm going to go through 4 sensitivity examples, and in each one of them have a few little detours that hopefully illuminate some of the aspects of using the sensor. Some of our earliest work was with Matty Marique again at Ford. And this is in a rig where we're using a soot generator, so a quenched propane mini cast soot generator to target a specific roughly 90 nanometer mean size distribution soot at fixed conditions. So in a fixed flow fixture with non-variable exhaust gas velocity, fixed exhaust gas temperature, fixed particle size, of course, distribution. And in that sort of a situation, it's practically a lab instrument, right? It has a R squared of 0.99 with a ABL MSS. All the error that comes in from being in real exhaust is significant, but if you didn't have any variations in all the dynamics that are out there, that's what you would see. And in this particular instance, the sensitivity, the sort of base or average sensitivity, is 4.32 nanoamps per milligram per cubic meter. So we'll come back to that. We'll talk about kind of a few different sensitivities, but with that setup, with a 90 nanometer soot and those conditions, that was the sensitivity. Before I move on to example number 2, let's talk a little bit about what does affect the sensitivity. What are the key variables? There's 2 that are obvious. We've already mentioned them. Exhaust gas temperature. You got to do an ideal gas law correction to know how much flux you're getting through the sensor itself, how much gas exchange. And then exhaust gas velocity, the residence time, essentially, of the, sorry, I keep hitting that. A little bit too much hand motion here. But the EGT and EGV are sort of obvious variables. The less obvious ones, perhaps, are particle charge distribution. As I mentioned before, the neutral fraction matters. And of course, particle charge distribution is a function of the Boltzmann distribution and combustion temperature. So for an engine family, at any given condition, it's very predictable and it's very stable. But you still need to understand it, right? If something changes the neutral fraction by a lot, then our sensitivity moves around a little bit. Particle size distribution is the big one that we're going to talk about more. But the particle size, of course, affects particle mobility. the surface area. And surface area is also affected by particle morphology, right? Every particle is not, some of them are more like snowflakes or cotton candy. Some of them are more like BBs or bowling balls or whatever, right? So the shape affects the overall current carrying capability. And then, as I mentioned, transients. So we'll talk a little bit about transients here. I sort of wish I had a slide that showed the behavior when there's a pressure pulse and nothing else changing, meaning if the concentration was fixed and, the other things were fixed and then there was a pressure pulse. But what occurs in that is you get a very short, like a less than a second signal spike over, incorrect over, I wouldn't say incorrect, but an over signal followed by a longer recovery, right? So you get, say, a half second spike followed by a 10-second recovery. And some work that Ahmad collected at Southwest Research was useful in this topic, and it was published in a paper that I'll reference in a moment in 2020. But without any more complex transfer function, without sort of trying to predict the pressure pulse behavior or impact, but just doing some basic filtering, right? So a 100-second moving average window, a 200-second moving average window, you can get pretty good R squares. You can get back up, for example, with 100 nanosecond, back up to like a 0.73 R squared, and with a longer one higher. So the conclusions from that paper for these for managing transients without building a complex transfer function or a big model or something like that was essentially that you can use this to get to measure low concentrations, and you can use these different moving average windows as sort of a simple way to get at least a good threshold indication. And I referenced the paper there. So moving back now to different sensitivity examples. So this is on a larger, actually from that same paper, but a 13-liter diesel. This soot happened to be smaller, so the mean was 67 nanometers. And with 100-second windows, the R squared was 0.82, and the sensitivity was 6.7 nanoamps per milligram per cubic meter, right? So we had that 4.31 earlier, this one 6.7. So and these are average for the cycle, right? So that we're not yet talking about if you see within a cycle variation, but that we're starting to see here that it is not practical, at least not very accurate if you're trying to avoid false positives, to say, the sensitivity is X, right? Because the sensitivity varies again with size distribution. So that's example number 2. Example number 3 is actually gasoline direct injected. So this is a GDI engine on a 2.3 liter EcoBoost, and significantly higher sensitivity, right? So 19.2 nanoamps per milligram per cubic meter. You also start to see, and this is a 49 nanometer mean size distribution. So smaller particles, like higher number, smaller particles, as one would expect from GDI. And another interesting thing, of course, is that the higher our sensitivity in nanoamps per milligram per cubic meter, also the lower our sensitivity floor, so to speak, right? So this on great R squared, in this instance with this data set, 0.94 R squared, but you're actually getting down to very close to 0. And I don't need to go back to those charts, but with the 90 nanometer soot, you start not having enough particles to even form the dendrites when you get down into, say, the 0.2 or 0.3 milligrams per cubic meter. So there's a relationship between signal per particle and what our sensitivity floor is, so to speak. And unfortunately, again, you've got to do work on your application to understand where that is, right? And to sort of chart it out for your particular application. But it's also promising and exciting to see that the sensor actually gets more sensitive with GDI and with higher number than it is with lower number, bigger soot. that might seem counterintuitive to some people. They'd say, well, it's smaller soot. It's probably harder to measure. But in this case, because of the charge carrying dynamics, it's more sensitive. So here's example number 4, and it also is illustrative of one other point that I wanted to make. And that is, well, 2 other points perhaps, and that is that while a moving average window is simple and it's functional, looking at the real-time signal is still pretty interesting. This particular setup was a medium-duty diesel truck, I think a 6.7 liter, on a chassis dyno, and we were using a DPF bypass, right? So we could vary the amount of bypass without changing anything else. So that means usually what you see on a drive cycle is every time there's a gear change or a load change or something, then you get those pressure pulses. In this case, we were just changing the bypass amount. So you can get these really nicely correlated steps where we're tracking right along with the reference instrument, except for this one part here where it shifts. And it happened, we noticed that it happened to correlate to a big shift in EGR percentage. So that's sort of an interesting illustration of the fact that if any engine parameter changes that alters the soot morphology, then it might be altering the sensitivity of the sensor in this case, right? So you need to look, we've had adopters look at maybe just a 3-bin type thing where you say, at idle, here's our sensitivity, at low load, here's our sensitivity, and at high load, here's our sensitivity. But if you also do a correction for EGR or other things, once you're doing the work, then they can get better, right? So this will be my conclusion, but the exact methodology one uses to do the OBM integration and the signal processing is actually where all the work over the next few years is going to be, right? Now that the sensor is on a path to commercialization and it's robust, the question is how to use it. Another interesting point here is that little startup period is pretty indicative of what it looks like when you're at a certain concentration, the field is there, you've got exhaust gas flowing, and it takes a little while until you're actually fully lit off, right? Until it's a full sensor. So unfortunately for the regulators who keep saying, oh, we need a cold start sensor for GDI, this isn't going to be a cold start sensor. It's very unlikely. There are situations where if the sensor has been everything, like, so, it's warmed up, the dendrites are all ready to go, and then you turn the engine off and turn it back on, you can actually get good data, provided that you don't have some liquid condensation blasting through the sensor or some other variable going on. But in general, that's what the startup looks like. So sort of summarizing those 4 examples, different soot sources, of course, different engines, in one case, not even an engine, but just a generator, different conditions, steady states, various drive cycles, the bypass. Unfortunately, or whatever, the reality is different generations of our sensors, which can change electrode gap spacing, electrode length, the Venturi tip itself, how much gas exchange we want to pull through the sensor. For example, are we really interested in idle and low load kind of conditions? We're really interested in the wide open throttle kind of conditions, and where do we shift that around? We actually, the Venturi tip, and Continental did a lot of this work, is actually pretty linear over a relatively wide range of exhaust gas velocities, but that has been a variable as we moved along. The electronics themselves, there's different ways to create the high voltage, there's different ways to sort of embody the amp meter. And then the seal, as one might imagine, having a really good electrically isolated, thermally isolated to some extent seal matters. Anyway, moving on with the chart, various different size distributions, and those are the different sensitivities we saw. So if there's one takeaway, it's that there's a relatively wide, it's not orders of magnitude, but a relatively wide sensitivity range. And to maximize accuracy in your application, in a given application, you need to actually do some real work with the reference instrument. One other kind of clear point is that even just reducing everything down to a single, size, mean size, like a single number, is a little bit reductionist, because as I mentioned before, you could have the same geometric number mean distribution, but with different soot morphology, right? So, a whole different sort of structural soot, and you might see a different, different sensitivity. So, one of the takeaways, at least for me, is that there's almost no way to avoid empirical work with it, right? You've got to just really put a reference instrument on application, put the sensors in, and then start building out your own sense of what your OBD logic would look like or will look like. Before I sort of wrap up the sensitivity thing, I did want to touch on sensor self-diagnostics for a second. So the sensor diagnostics are really kind of the same as most OBD sensors, right? You're looking at things like out of range, high or low, stability or rate of change. If the rate of change is higher than it should be, then you question the plausibility. For the vehicle related aspects, obviously, besides is it getting a good voltage and is there CAN communication present? One of the interesting ones, especially a hot topic, right, with this audience, is tampering, right? So there are a variety of ways to look at the question of, is it installed, right? Has it been sort of just pulled out or cut or done something like that? The one that Continental kind of settled on is what they call condensation peak detection. So the ECU knows ambient temperature and knows the last time it was on and knows things like that. And if the sensor is in the exhaust, you always, even at a half a volt, not 1,000 volts, but you're going to see a little bit of liquid, of condensation going through the sensor that creates this sort of a representative condensation peak signature. Here's another example also, by the way, of once you decide to turn the high voltage on, then you've got the startup time, and then you're really sensing, right? Then you're really going. Another method for tampering is just straight ground path quality, right? So what the ground offset is when it's properly installed, and if you're sufficiently far away from that, then something has probably tampered with. That doesn't mean it's foolproof. If someone knows how to take the sensor out and make sure it's well grounded anyway, or something like that, then that every tampering detection can be, well, I don't know if everyone can, but most of them can be defeated with enough work. And then there's a variety of what I would call ECU to sensor correlations, right? You can look, for example, at regeneration, DPF regeneration. So the ECU knows a regeneration is being triggered. We usually see a sort of indicative regeneration spike, right? There's a signature where there's a little bit of extra soot coming out of the DPF when it's burning off, and other things like pressure pulses, EGR changes appear to be potentially plausible, and this is where a lot of work is being done right now. And frankly, some of our early adopters have a better sense of what they're seeing on their application than we do, right? They're not, sharing it all with us. The challenge that's probably obvious about things like the signature of a pressure pulse. Like I just had a big load change, and I should see that, is that behind a properly working filter, DPF, GPF, the signal is so small that's all damped, right? So what might look like a relatively large spike from a pressure pulse, if you were going engine out soot, the signal gets much smaller behind a properly operating filter. So some of the tampering, if you're just looking at operating condition signatures, is not easy to figure out. But that's a quick sort of high level overview on the normal sort of self-diagnostics. The biggies are, is the high voltage in range? Is the signal looking plausible? And how does it look relative to the vehicle environment? So what do we have here? An important new combustion sensor, right? So oxygen sensors were in the 70s and 80s and 90s. NOx sensors have been in the, I guess, 90s and aughts and 10s. And there have been others around. But even with no transfer function, with no model running, with no predictive logic going on, and just a, say, 100-second moving average window, the data could argue that it's a sort of a plus or minus 30% sensor, which for OBD detection of is the filter working or not, or is it degrading or is it there is sufficient. And of course, you're getting sick. We report signals at 10 hertz, but if you're doing a 100-second moving average window, you can sort of consider it whatever time constant you want, but you can achieve just about any IUPR or IUMPR or MAR or whatever the different acronyms are. As I mentioned before, the limitations are startup time, the calibration, and the transients. The obvious advantages are all the, sensitivity and response time. So in conclusion, ePM is on a path to commercial availability with a new global tier 1 agreement executed last year, DV samples or B samples available next year, and serial production slated for 2028. Probably model year 29 is the first, real year that things could be on or later. The tier 1 supplier is advancing development on all fronts. So we have a lot of work going on right now, which is exciting. They are also a tier 2 supplier. So I wanted to mention that to any other integrators. They're one of the bigger tier 2 suppliers, and they will be, I would say, eager to support integration efforts by other, tier 1. So people that have a whole after treatment system to try to figure out, or even just looking at compliance strategies for future models or certification strategies for future models. An opportunity exists to develop application-specific OBD strategies, right? If there's any fundamental rhetorical point I'm trying to make, it's that the work around not does the sensor work, but how do we use it? That's really going to be the work of the next few years. And there's a great opportunity not only to do that on your applications, but potentially to develop some proprietary advantages or some ways to use the sensor that are unique. I would predict that it will probably be like narrowband oxygen sensors to wideband oxygen sensors and other things that start as a regulatorily driven sensor, but quickly become something where people start maybe getting closed loop or doing closed loop controls, maybe preventative maintenance or other things like that. So there's information that can be gathered from the sensor. And the same sensors that we have been providing now for the last year or two in the form of developers kits, evaluation kits, they continue to be available from us. So those are suitable for evaluation and development, but not for serial production, meaning that we would never, MSense is not trying to be a tier 1 or a tier anything. But we do have developers kits available. And with that, I think, so there's my contact information. I'd like to thank Joe Fitzpatrick, Kent Johnson from UCR, Imad and Vinay from Southwest Research, the US Card Group, and Matty Marique, as I mentioned, has been he was kind of the godfather of helping us figure this out in the first place. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you, Patrick. Are there any questions from the audience or online? Oh, there's one.
Hello, Marco Moser, IAV here. My question is to your sensor. You need a model to find. Did I understand it wrong? I mean, from my perspective, it was like you have a sensor with sensor data, but it's not. The sensor data is not usable directly, but you need to see the circumstances. So you have a model with a sensor input to.
Yeah, that's, if I understand the question correctly, that's one of the big advantages of it is you don't need a model, right? It's not model, but we don't have to run a model that's predicting what the regen duration is going to be and then comparing some sort of regeneration to our model. Some calibration work is required to say what's in this engine platform with this fuel map and with this EGR map, what's our sensitivity, but you don't have to have any model going for that.
Yes, but this is what I mean. This is what I mean.
Sorry.
It's computational model. Yes, for me it's a model. Okay. But it's calibration for you. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, okay. Then maybe I should say we believe that the utility is a far simpler model than the model you might run in
Yes.
other cases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Okay.
it should
Thank-
reduce OBM development costs, hopefully. I don't
Yeah.
know. Oh, OBD. I'm not even talking about OBM.
Further questions? Okay,
We go
so
back on
thanks a
schedule.
lot,
Yes.
and we'll be back in half, right?
Thank you.